Well, thanks for having me. I have to say, this is a quaint environment. I like it, and I will stop as we go, given the kind of environment we're in, and I'll just see if you're tracking. If you want to ask questions, I know we had talked about questions at the end. I'm looking around here. I know I talked about questions at the end, but I might stop, and there'll be times as I'm talking, like you can talk. Don't just yell at me to quit talking, but I'll ask for you guys to give me some feedback. So, first of all, I want to start off by saying I have a long history with doubt. I can remember sitting in the pews, growing up in a Baptist church, praying what if you're a Christian, you grew up in a church, you probably know what I mean when I say a sinner's prayer. And I can remember as a teenager saying that because I would hear sermons with tropes like, if you are only 99% sure, you're 100% lost. Now, for a teenager who is at all self-reflective, that can lead to some serious psychological anguish. And it did. I can remember the anxiety I felt as a young college student when a professor exposed my ignorance of how the New Testament actually worked. I was a committed Christian, but I was also fairly naive. I was a business major. I'm not suggesting all business majors are naive. But this was my first religion class at a state university. And I found out pretty quickly my high school youth group pizza parties had not prepared me for that. In my 20s, I felt the pain of being that guy in the Bible studies, the one who couldn't get past the first verse because my head was spinning over whether this verse contradicted that verse, or what I was supposed to do with the Nephilim in Genesis 6, or whether what I was learning about science could be squared with the opening verses of Genesis, and then the list would go on and on. Thank goodness I didn't know about Reddit threads then, because that would sink me into a huge abyss that I don't know if I would ever come out of. I have been on those, by the way, but just not at that point. The demons of doubt have not been completely banished, even now. But now, at least, the legions mostly hide out in the shadows, though they can unpredictably surface. Another reporting of a school shooting. A friend of ours, mother of 3, just got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer, breast cancer. And in such moments, sometimes I can't help but think, why would a good God allow that? Or it can be more unexpected, more mundane activities, walking through a museum, peering at the tangible traces of people who lived before Christ and wondering, why did Jesus come so late? The questions are not new. I'm not the first Christian, the first person to ask such questions, and I'm not the first person to think of responses. I often go back to responses when I get my emotions in check, or if I'm working through these things with people who have questions or struggling with doubt. But in the end, I'm not always sure which is the best answer, which is actually the answer to these. Over time, I've learned to accept unknowns. I've learned to live with mystery. I've learned that maturity in life means living with different levels of confidence, different degrees of confidence. So as a Christian, I live by faith in a God who does make sense of things. Still, there is so much I can't make sense of. As the Apostle Paul puts it, I see through a glass darkly, and so through Christ I really do see. I'll talk more about that at the end of my talk. But I also confess that darkness still lingers. I say this not to valorize my doubt, as if it is something we should celebrate. For a Christian perspective on doubt anyway, isn't that doubt is to be celebrated. It's like, yes, doubt, yes, that's a great thing. No, that's not the message of the New Testament. That's not the message of the Bible. But the struggle with doubt is also not something we should condemn either. Instead, doubt is a reality we need to learn to face. I don't believe one can simply snap their fingers to produce or sustain faith in the midst of doubt or disillusionment. That's just simply not how it works. But I do believe you can learn to seek and live in such a way that faith will be there in the end. This doesn't mean your doubts or your misgivings will completely vanish, especially not tonight after hearing my talk. I don't want to raise the expectations like that. Or if you just read my book, all your doubts will go away. If you just give me your money, if anyone tells you otherwise, they are selling you something and you should run fast the other way, okay? I am not a guru, all right? I don't have a magic wand, but I am here tonight to give you what I hope is a good word. Doubt doesn't have to be the final word. Disillusionment doesn't have to incapacitate your faith. I believe in Jesus Christ and the claims of his earliest followers for a variety of what I find to be really good reasons. And I've learned to keep seeking and digging around in books, talking to other Christians, trying on ancient ways of seeing and exploring new, but actually really old practices. New to me sometimes, but finding these old ways, these ancient ways of wisdom. In other words, through the years I have found ways to deal with doubt, not to vanquish all my doubts, but to grow through them, even with them. I've learned God can mysteriously bring good from suffering, including the agony of doubt and disillusionment. And that is a good word tonight if you're struggling. Now, I also want to say that something has historically changed that makes the struggle with faith and doubt different, particularly today. A couple of you have talking about Surprised by Doubt, the book that this talk is based on, said this is kind of timely. This book is timely. Well, that's good news for authors. I'll just tell you, it's still not. We're not funding college with this or anything. But there is something that has changed. And one of the things, though, I would say, even as I've said, something has changed, something that's changed that we might say makes belief seem less plausible to many people today, I need to quickly add to that statement, I need to nuance it to say, people have always struggled with doubt. Read the Gospels, the story of Thomas, right? Even seeing the resurrected Lord, we know in the Gospels, people doubted. People had trouble with that. Read church history. But something in particular has changed so that many today find Christianity less plausible than they, in the West at least, than they did, say, 500 years ago. Now, there's different ways to explain what has happened. And now, there's one way to explain what happened, and maybe some of you are thinking along this line, is to say, well, it's because we have discovered science. I believe in science. We all believe in science. And once you believe in science, then you don't believe silly religious myths. That makes for this kind of coming-of-age story rooted in science. And the force of that is actually the story, not the facts. There's a really long book called A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, who says, actually, that's what we would call a subtraction story. A subtraction story is what you get when you wrongly imagine that our modern secular world is the leftover once you simply subtract out God. But in fact, and I'm taken by Taylor's argument here, and I won't have time to unpack it, but Taylor argues that certain assumptions or the ways that we have imagined the world has shifted, and this isn't because we have so much reasoned our way there, but instead the way we attend to the world has changed. We haven't reasoned our way to attending the world differently, but now we've inherited a way to spontaneously see the world minus God, minus transcendence or enchantment. And we've inherited this way of seeing the world, not because of science, although science is part of that story, but because of, well, actually complex historical reasons. Reasons that aren't essential for this talk tonight, but I'm just wanting to point this out in general. And the way to get at this, the way I want to get at this to kind of frame where I'm going, is to talk about 3 features of our rationality. So if you've read the book, this isn't in the book, okay? This is extra. Okay? So there's 3 features of rationality. Now, what I'm talking about is how you perceive what is rational. Now, let's interact on this for a second. When you say something's rational, on what basis are you making that claim? What goes into how you view something as rational? Any ideas? Okay, so there's experiences, there's things you are going to observe. I have a category for that. Let's call that the evidence available. Okay? An experience is evidence. It's things you see, you observe, whether internally or externally. And so there's evidence available. Let me back up even prior to that. What we perceive as rational lands, the first thing I would say is basic logic, right? So if I come in here tonight and I'm making a case for Christianity, and I were to say 1 + 2 = 4, you would say that's not good logic, and you would be right. Or if I said you could have a married bachelor, that would not be good logic. So there's basic logic. Now, how far are you going to get with basic logic? Not very far. Study the history of philosophy, right? So there's more. That's important. That's really important. We have basic logic, but there's more than that. There's also the evidence available. So what we perceive as rational is based on what evidence is available, and some people have different. There's at different times there's been different evidence available to different people. Now there's a third thing, and this is people who are doing work in the sociology of rationality. The third piece is what they call social imaginary, or what I was referring to before as inherited assumptions. These big assumptions about the world that, for instance, 500 years ago, you could, for many people, they just assume an enchanted world. They looked out and they saw this world as signs to a deeper, transcendent reality. You couldn't escape that. When they talked about demons, they really believed in them, right? That was the world. And so Augustine, in the early 5th century, when he's writing his apologetic called City of God, he talks about demons throughout, but he doesn't make a case for them. He doesn't have to. Whether you're a Christian or not, people just took those for granted, that there was this enchanted world around them. That's what Charles Taylor means when he talks about a social imaginary, how we spontaneously see the world. The metaphors by which we interpret data, the metaphors which give us what we're going to attend to and what we're not going to attend to. One of the challenges in our age today is we have so much data, we can't always attend to those. What questions are we going to ask, right? We can't attend to all the data, so what are we going to focus on? And so there's a view of rationality for many of us that we forget about that third component, what I'm calling social imaginary or inherited assumptions, or you could call it a meta-narrative. We think to be rational is just to use basic logic and look at the evidence. But actually what philosophers are saying is what does the heavy lifting is this bigger social imaginary which the evidence and the basic logic sits within. So in our time tonight, I will not attempt to tidily answer all your questions. That would be glib. Nor do I think I can teach you to zap all of your own friends' doubts away, if that's why you came. I don't have any doubt-zapping guns. But I do want to think through how those three things, in particular social imaginary, or our posture and the way we attend to the world, actually impacts this question of belief and doubt. And so in what follows, what I want to offer you are patterns of living, or maybe another way to put this, think of about another metaphor, is a posture to try on. So even if you're not a Christian today, a kind of posture, right? Because we all have certain assumptions. So what might it be like to adopt a certain Christian posture and try on and see the world? And what I'm doing is what C.S. Lewis described as, or what my aim is that we might fall back into the reality of Christ. And in hopes of getting at this, I'm going to offer you two different figures. One will serve as a kind of cautionary tale, and we'll spend most of our time there. And at the end, I want to come back to one of my heroes in the faith, in particular because of his journey was plagued with doubt. And yet that's not typically what he's remembered for, and that's St. Augustine. But first, a figure that's very different from St. Augustine. It's a modern-day scholar by the name of Bart Ehrman. Now, Bart Ehrman is the author of multiple New York Times best-selling books and is a biblical scholar who teaches at University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. His popular writings are framed by his journey from fundamentalism to evangelicalism to kind of mainline Christianity to eventually agnosticism. By his own telling, Ehrman loses his faith in the Bible while he's in graduate school. Over time, his misgivings turned into a major problem. His coming-of-age story is one of hard-earned unbelief, culminating in his facing the fact that the Bible probably isn't what he had long thought it was. For Ehrman, quote, the floodgates opened, and he came to see the Bible as, in his words, a very human book filled with errors. While Ehrman's departure from his earlier evangelical views of the Bible certainly shook him, by his own account, it wasn't the breaking point. That came, in his own words, when he could no longer explain how there could be a God and be a good and all-powerful God actively involved with this world, given the state of things. In other words, he couldn't resolve the question of evil and God. Now, I want to say that I'm personally sympathetic with Ehrman's struggle. I'm personally sympathetic with this problem. In some ways, I've come close to agreeing with Ehrman. In fact, I'm not startled when people admit they can't answer the problem of evil. I'm not shocked by that. Instead, the more I've reflected on human suffering and evil, the more I'm taken aback when someone claims they can. Often the way that I think well-meaning Christians approach the question actually avoids its difficulties. In trying to justify God, they overreach and they justify too much. When an answer to the problem of evil does that, I find myself responding with an Ehrman-like skepticism. But I'd also point out to you tonight, there's actually different forms of skepticism. Even perhaps Christian forms of skepticism. I'm what philosophers would call a skeptical theist. What do I mean by that? Well, it's something along the lines of what the Christian philosopher Alvin Plantinga, and by the way, Alvin Plantinga is I would suggest, the most important Christian philosopher of the 20th century. And he says that Christians shouldn't claim to know the answer to the problem of evil. In his own words, Christians don't, nor do other believers in God, as far as I know, really know why God permits evil. Well, you might read that out of context and say, what's going on here tonight, Josh? And so in some sense, what I'm starting off with saying is that in some sense, I agree with Ehrman. We do not have the problem. We do not have the answer to the problem of evil. I don't have an answer for you tonight. That's hard for an apologist to say. I do have a response, though. I do have a response. And this brings me to two postures And let's call them posture problems that Ehrman's story helps to illustrate. So these are posture problems. I'm out tonight to correct our posture, and Ehrman's a cautionary tale. Problem number 1, an overconfidence in our own capacities to understand and solve. People, particularly moderns, so one of the things I'm asking you to do is consider your cultural locatedness here. We as moderns commonly assume that if God exists, all his cards are on the table. With confidence in our cognitive powers, we moderns assume that there is no divine idea that we should not be able to grasp, that we should not be able to get our head around. Notably, we as believers can display a similar overconfidence in our ability to answer the whys of evil. Now, I'm guessing, just given a little bit of conversation I've had with some of you, that you've grown up in, many of you, not everyone, but some of you have grown up in church or grown up in Christian camps and had some experiences with something like this. The speaker strides up to the pulpit and claims to have the answer to the evil. His or her answer is tidy, and it makes his audience or her audience feel good, heightening their expectations. They imagine the expert apologists have solved the problem, but one day, some begin to grow out of such simple solutions. And I want to say, rightly so. In fact, one of the reasons why I'm using this as an initial test case, as a cautionary tale to correct our posture, is as I think this kind of overconfidence, this sense of having mastered the things of God, can spill over into many parts of our thinking. We get comfortable in our safe suburban lifestyles, unconsciously going about our days and weeks, feeling as if we've got a pretty good handle on things. God's our wingman, and we've got this thing under control. And then a pandemic hits, or a cancer diagnosis comes our way, or we're faced with the reality that life is fragile and we don't have the kind of control that we like to think we have. In some sense, modernity has built this kind of illusion that we can have all this control. And then life keeps coming at us. This is whether you're a Christian or not, right? And so in response, we frantically try to control as much as possible. But the result is that we're often burdened with an even deeper sense of angst. And so we're left confused, anxious, and maybe even angry. For we don't know how to cope when we are faced with our own vulnerability, our own humanness, our own mortality. And all of this is rooted in a kind of delusional view of our own capacities. We've been reading our own press. And this misplaced confidence in our own capacity to reach into the heavens has metastasized in our modern world. After all, evil, suffering, death are old problems. Previous societies have wrestled with them emotionally and intellectually, yet their struggles led them to lament. It led them to, many times, deeper prayer. But what it didn't lead to as a cultural phenomenon is unbelief, is denying God's existence. You might just read Job or read the Psalms. You don't get tidy answers there, but you also don't get wholesale unbelief. These are people who understood there were certain mysteries. There were certain ways to doubt while still believing. They wrestled with God, but their suffering didn't lead them to deny God's existence. That's a particular kind of, as a cultural phenomenon, a very modern, contemporary response. Now we assume that by analyzing and deciphering the cosmic saved, we should be able to solve these ancient problems. Faith becomes more like a math problem. We try to solve doubt with an equation. If the equation doesn't work out, we give up on faith. In regards to suffering, one begins to think if there is a God and he has reasons for permitting evil, his reasons should be intelligible to us. If they're not intelligible, if I can't get my mind around them, well, then one option is to end up like Ehrman's book title. It's God's problem. And this leads to problem number 2. Again, I'm trying to adjust some posture here. The first one was this posture of overconfidence in our own capacities to understand and solve. And number two, this false-related problem of posture is a false expectation for how Christianity and the Bible works. So one of the things, if you're exploring tonight Christianity, it's just good to know what this thing is, right? That's a pretty good place to start. And one of the things I'm saying is it's not having all your questions answered. That's tough for us to deal with, isn't it? Yeah. What the Bible doesn't say is, bring me all your questions and I'm going to have the answers I'm going to have all these answers for you. That's not what God has delivered. Now, I do think there's answers in the Bible. I do think answers are important, but it's a matter of expectation here, okay? And so problem number two, false expectations for how Christianity and the Bible works. Now, it's deeper than this. It's deeper than what I just said, so still track with me. Back to Ehrman now. Ehrman sets out to describe the Bible as offering 5 different responses, well, at least what I would call responses to evil. Now, I'm just curious what you guys think of those, okay? So, listen up for these 5. Suffering comes from God as punishment against sin. Suffering is the result of human beings sinning against other human beings. Suffering is redemptive. Suffering is a test of faith. Suffering is at times mysterious. And what I've done is, in his book, I've taken those out and said, he's pointing out how the Bible gives these different, what I would call responses, he might call answers, but responses to suffering. Now, for those of you who are in here who are Christian, I just wonder, what do you think about those, biblically speaking? I'll tell you what I think. Just pause for a second for you to think. It's fine if you didn't respond, because you didn't. So here's what I think. I think they're pretty good if we see them as responses. If we look at them and say, does this exhaust everything? Does this get into the mind of God such that we can explain every evil thing that happened? Absolutely not. But is that how the Bible works? Is that what the Bible's doing? So I agree with Ehrman that each of these are found in different places in the Bible, but this is where, and remember what I said about his journey, he started giving up on certain kind of convictions about what the Bible is, and then the next step was evil. But this is where I would want to suggest that I pick up where Ehrman's posture towards the Bible spills over into his conclusions about God. For Ehrman pits these biblical responses, and I do think they are biblical responses, but he pits them against each other. But he needn't. There's no good reason to do so. Nothing demands that we read the Bible this way. In fact, I would suggest the Bible itself has clues that we shouldn't be reading the Bible that way, pitting it against each other. As if the Bible is some kind of systematic theology text. That's not how the Bible works. I see no good reason to expect that the biblical authors always give the same response to a complicated question. Ancient readers certainly didn't expect a sacred text to work this way. Many of I know Mark Genelette maybe was here last month, so he might have talked about some of this. He's a good biblical theologian, my colleague. But the way the Bible is working is the textual tradition where they're picking up, right, on what went before. The New Testament authors are very aware of what went before, and the later Old Testament authors are aware of what went before. And so the biblical authors are aware and respect this broader textual tradition, aiming to expand and layer responses to weighty concepts like evil and suffering. In doing this, they offer what I would call a web of responses. And they're framed in a particular way for particular communities that speak at the complexity of evil. I find this to actually be one of the richest features of how the Bible works. The Bible comes to us, and it speaks in a profound way to people facing different situations at different times. My friend, the philosopher, he's a philosopher, Chris Watkins, he talks about it like the biblical response is like this. He says they're reductive if you treat them in isolation, right? Think about that. Suffering is the test of faith. Well, that doesn't always work out, right? Suffering is redemptive. I can think of lots of cases where that doesn't seem redemptive. Okay, so if you isolate those things, you've got a problem. But when they're woven together into this biblical canon, but just in the Bible, different authors at different times, what they actually provide, and this is Chris again, they provide a rich, complex, and existentially authentic view of the world. In other ways, it gives us a way to live that's deep, that's wise. So in short, expectations matter, right? If you come saying systematic theology, line it up like this, you might be disappointed. But what if you simply have the wrong expectations of the Bible? Expectations that are sometimes inherited from well-meaning Christian communities and remain intact long after a person has moved on. So what I've seen happen is even what we might call, in a pejorative way, fundamentalists, often are still working with certain fundamentalist assumptions even after they've jumped from the Christian house. This is how the Bible is supposed to work. This is how faith is supposed to work. It's not working that way. And what I'm suggesting is maybe somehow along the way you've had the wrong expectations of how this is supposed to go. And what I have found as I've kind of in my own life had to kind of begin again at different times, go back to the Bible, see what it's doing, is it's given me this rich, layered way to respond to trials and suffering, to the evil I see in the world that I can't completely give an answer to, but I can respond to in an appropriate way. The more I've studied the Bible, the more I've come to see it as offering rich and nuanced responses to life's most important questions. Like a wise teacher, the Bible flavors textured responses over rote answers. And its responses are intelligible to children and yet brimming with enough nuance and depth to hold the attention of the most brilliant mind, if received with the appropriate posture. The Bible is offering us a way to live in light of the good news of Jesus. And I should add, it offers us a way to walk with God through the uncertainties and pain of life. Now, I want to circle back around. How are we doing on time? How are we doing on time? Are we good? Or what's my target before we get into Q&A?
We're here till 9.
Okay, all right. So now, just hang with me. I know I don't know where you guys are at, and I don't know how this is fully being received. But hang with me on this one just for a second. It's about to get a little philosophical. It'll be worth it, I think. What else am I going to say, right? So here's the classic problem of evil. God is all-powerful. God is all-loving or all-good. There is suffering. All right? So a way to get at this is the Christian Bible. So if you think of theism in light of the Christian Bible, it presents this God as all-powerful, all-knowing. And it also presents God as loving, as compassionate. And yet we look around and we also see that there's really bad things in the world. And so this is known as the classic problem of evil. And so after surveying the responses, again, what he sees as answers, I would say the Bible's offering us responses, not answers, again, but he sees as these answers to this problem. Ehrman concludes that an all-powerful and an all-loving God cannot exist with what he views as evil and suffering in the world. Okay, so what I would suggest, and this is going back to my first point, is that the Bible offers us a fourth premise. According to the Bible, neither God nor his ways can be fully known by humans. The biblical authors assume God is infinite and we are finite. It doesn't mean that the Bible is saying, just be quiet and believe. I've already said the Bible's giving different responses, textured, layered. But what the Bible's also saying is there's this huge gap between the God who is really there and us as humans. And so this fourth premise changes the conclusion. I mentioned skeptical theism, one of the leading skeptical theists. That means they believe in God, but they're skeptical about being able to answer the problem of suffering, but actually don't think that's a good reason not to believe, is a guy named John Wickstra. And he has this metaphor that's been picked up in popular literature. If you've read Reason for God, I think Keller maybe uses it there. My memory's going, but I think he uses a version of it there. And this is Wickstra, though, actually, is where it came from. And he talks about our inability to see no-see-ums. Now, for those of you who don't know what no-see-ums are, you probably can figure it out by the title. But they're a tiny fly not visible to the naked eye. And he compares that with our ability to see a large dog. Now, if I were standing beside you and said, look at the giant dog right there, and everyone looks and there's no dog, what would you conclude? I am a liar, or I'm delusional, or something, right? If I say there is a no-see-um, what do you conclude? There's no way for you to evaluate that claim, right? At least you would have to trust me on my authority. Am I in a position to know for some reason that there's a no-see-um there? Likewise, if God is the God revealed in the Scripture, so if we're basing the problem of evil on the God of the Bible and saying that's God's problem, the God revealed in Scripture, and this is Wickra's conclusion, we have good reasons to think that if there were God-purposed goods for suffering, there's some reasons that God had for allowing this, these would be beyond our ken. Ultimately, they'd be beyond. We wouldn't be in a position to know. This is why another philosopher, John Cottingham, is right, I think, to say this. And this is a long quote, but I think it's worth it. To believe in God is not to be able to explain why terrible things happen and why many lives are ruined or tragically cut short. The message of the book of Job is absolutely clear on this point. There is no explanation, or no explanation we can comprehend. To be a believer is not to solve this problem, but it is something else entirely. It is to hold that the meaning and purpose of our lives is to live in accordance with the sacred requirements of justice and compassion. To believe in God is to believe that we are required by a holy and inviolable power, not of ourselves, to do what is right and avoid what is wrong. So I think if you actually leave these misguided expectations, or if you begin maybe in the Lord's grace tonight even to adjust your posture, then you might just discover some compelling reasons to believe in the midst of your questions. Believe in the midst of your doubts. The famous example of this is an author that many of you know, C.S. Lewis. He once rejected Christianity along the line similar to Ehrman, particularly the problem of evil. Yet, Lewis, as he's writing later as a Christian, talks about how this problem with evil itself, the very questions he had, was actually ended up being a problem that atheism couldn't explain. Here's what he says. My argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In other words, the fact that evil is a problem that perplexes us, that repulses us, that angers us, seems to gesture to something beyond us, some standard beyond us. Given the deep intuition that this world shouldn't be like this, have you ever asked yourself why it is that you feel it shouldn't be? Why would we expect a world of nothing more than matter and energy to be anything other than absurd and violent? Why do we struggle so fiercely against the reality of the way things are? Why not just go by our instincts? Like Lewis, if we go so far as to reject God on the basis of evil, we are intuitively bearing witness that we believe in some kind of standard by which to judge the universe. It might just be that buried beneath your skeptical doubts, you can find reasons to believe. For not only does Christianity proclaim a moral universe and provide a foundation for these deep intuitions, these moral intuitions, but it also provides resources for what our present society is perhaps lacking the most right now. The ability to face evil, the ability to live through suffering, and to live through suffering without surrendering to the worst of human tendencies. Now, I should say, in simple words, that's a big deal. The University of Columbia professor Andrew Delbanco, not a Christian, but he's observed this. He talks about how, well, let me just quote him. A gulf has opened up in our culture between the visibility of evil and the intellectual resources available for coping with it. Okay, so if you're following along with me, I'm making a move right now in my talk. I've started off dealing with some posture issues, and now hopefully in that I've dealt, maybe satisfactory to some of you, the logical problem. And I said I can't give you an answer, but I can respond to say that believing in a God in the face of evil isn't irrational, given the claims about this God that we find in Scripture. And now I'm saying, okay, but we need something more. We have to live. How can we actually cope? Right? How do we actually do? In the midst of the mental health crisis, in the midst of the anxieties that we feel at this cultural moment, the political election that's coming our way, and some of the worst of our tendencies that come out during that, how do we actually deal with this? Another way to say this is critiquing's pretty easy. Critiquing's pretty easy. Give me your worldview and give me enough time and I can critique it, right? And Christians aren't immune to that, right? The Christian has 2,000 years. If you're a believer, you have 2,000 years of history. We can start kind of pointing our fingers at things, right? And I want to say, in one sense, all of that can be maybe even too easy. But offering a consistent, livable way, alternative to what we critique, that's a little bit harder. And since we all have to live somewhere, consider what Christianity offers in comparison with what I would call Ehrman's happy agnosticism. Now, don't miss this point. If you're here tonight, if you're walking with someone through doubt or someone who is about to leave the faith, they aren't jumping to nothingness. If you're thinking about leaving Christianity, there's a lot to think about there, but you're not just jumping into nothing. You're jumping into something. Or if you're evaluating Christianity tonight, you're already living in some space. You have some values. You have some way of life. And so one of the things, and it's important for all of us to ask, is how will we live? And how do we live? How does that actually match up with what we say we believe? To draw on Delbanco here, and what he said about our culture's lack of intellectual resources, how does Ehrman's happy agnosticism give us ways to cope with evil and suffering? Well, at the end of his book, he actually provides this. Now, granted, it's one example, right? So I don't want to disrespect anyone if this is not where you're at. I'm just interacting with Ehrman tonight. But here's one option, and here's how he is dealing with that. He gets to the end, and he offers this. He says, this life is all there is. But then he goes on, he doesn't find this to be an occasion for despair and despondency. Instead, as he puts it, this should be a source of joy and dreams. Joy of living for the moment and dreams of trying to make the world a better place. both for ourselves and for others in it. He continues, I think we should work hard to make the world, the one we live in, the most pleasing place it can be for ourselves. We should love and be loved. We should cultivate our friendships, enjoy our intimate relationships, cherish our family lives. I just want to add real quick, amen to that, right? We should make money and spend money. The more, the better. We should enjoy good food and drink. We should eat out and order unhealthy desserts. And we should cook steaks on the grill and drink Bordeaux. We should walk around the block, work in the garden, watch basketball, and drink beer. We should travel and read books and go to museums and look at art and listen to music. We should drive nice cars and have nice homes. We should make love and have babies and raise families. We should do what we can to love life. It's a gift, and it will not be with us for long. But we should also work hard to make our world the most pleasing place it can be for others. We need to live life to its fullest and help others as well to enjoy the fruits of the land. End of quote. Now, there's a lot there that I can amen a few more times. But I do have some concerns. Ehrman urges an unvarnished pursuit of personal contentment and pleasure in the things that this world has to offer. Note that Ehrman's advice, though, offers measly resources for practically living out the ethics, having the fortitude and the joy that he commends. It offers no moral grounding for why someone should feel obligated to live the kind of moral life he describes at the end. The first part of his vision, as I said, enjoying life by way of nice cars and homes and food. In one sense, we want to say there's maybe nothing wrong with that, but it will inevitably be in tension with his charge to help others. While I share his moral sensibility that we should care for others, why do so if it requires us to give up time spent in our gardens, or if it prevents us from working overtime that's working overtime so we can get the car, or we can get the vacation, or we can get the steaks, or live in the neighborhood that he describes? If life is fleeting, shouldn't I protect my resources? Right? Shouldn't it be about protecting and trying to stay in control? Ehrman never gives a motivating rationale for caring for others, for not playing the zero-sum game. And if Ehrman is correct in saying that this world is all there is, then one should be willing to look realistically at what it means to live consistently, given that worldview. What does this mean for those who can't enjoy cars and fine wines? What does this mean for those who enjoy such luxuries but are crippled with a dull emptiness and anxious restlessness? What does this mean for the person tonight in hospice care with a terminal diagnosis? The clouds of suffering and loss, which Ehrman reminds us so powerfully in his work. It's like he gets to the end and he just turns a different direction and doesn't want to look back. But they cast a dark shadow over the gift of life Ehrman encourages us to enjoy. But if Ehrman is correct, if we are alone in the universe, then we need to face the fact that his good news, the gospel according to Ehrman, rings pretty hollow. Instead of proclaiming joy to be found in the news that this life is all there is, as the British novelist and author Francis Spurford has put it, he might as well have said, "There's no help coming." In Spurford's words, it amounts to a denial of hope or consolation on any but the most chirpy, squeaky, bubbly, gummy reading of the human situation. By the way, the human situation, the bubble gummy reading of the human situation is just what he has punctured, Ehrman, in the 200 pages before this. And St. Augustine, I don't know why I just made this. It's St. Augustine. Don't tell anyone I just mispronounced that. St. Augustine, it's late. I'm over 40 and it's late. Don't tell anybody, right? It's Augustine, and this is being recorded. We will edit that. St. Augustine called this kind of thing cruel optimism. He called it cruel optimism 1,500 years ago, and it is still cruel. Spufford is not alone in making this evaluation. Many people who have similar doubts as Ehrman continue to believe. Not because they have solved the problem of evil or have figured out exactly what God is up to. No, their response is much more humble. It's also much more ancient. It's also much more Christian, I would suggest. Instead, like Lewis, they recognize the intuitions lying beneath their revulsion towards evil. They can't shake the feeling that this world is not as it should be, but they also recognize that this deep-seated intuition isn't rational unless there is some kind of standard beyond this world. They also can't so easily reconcile the idea that this life is all there is with the claim that there is nothing to be frightened of. And like Ehrman, they too sense that life is a gift. And they ask the question, if life is a gift, where is the giver? Where does a gift come from if there is not a giver? So one option is to opt to follow Ehrman and leave Christianity. Ehrman's not the only way one might leave, but it's certainly one. And I think it's one, though, that rests with certain expectations and a certain posture for how Christianity works. Our overconfident sense that we as humans should be able to understand God. But once you recalibrate, once you get your posture set differently, once you what I would call is you have a more rational understanding of rationality and what it means to be human, then I would want to suggest to you there's a whole lot of reasons to believe in the midst of your doubts. And so many continue to do so, even in this complicated modern world where the plausibility structures, the way we spontaneously imagine the world to be has changed. And I want to encourage those. I want to ask the question for those of you who are struggling with doubt tonight or questions that are unresolved. Why not jump in this way of inhabiting Christianity? Why not try it on? Join us in looking around and acknowledging that we are the recipients of gifts and then turn to trust the giver. Join us in looking to the one who gave us not only life, but who came to us and gave us his own life. I promised I was going to talk about St. Augustine, and I still want to say a few words here as I close. Augustine is someone who's experienced what we might label anachronistically today, deconstruction. Except, as I said, he lived 1,500 years ago. Augustine of Hippo's life story reminds us that even revered saints were sometimes critics of their childhood faith. So you're in good company. Augustine was a prodigious young man who was raised in the backwaters of the Roman Empire. He was raised in a small-town fundamentalist church in the Roman Bible Belt. For young Augustine, Christianity was basically synonymous with authoritarian leaders, hard and fast rules, and literalist interpretations of, about everything. Augustine's father was a pagan. His mom was a Christian. Monica, his mom, was devout. He loved her son. He wept for his salvation. And as an ancient version of a helicopter mom, she followed him everywhere. Just read Confessions. I am not kidding. Arranging marriages. If you think you have it bad, just meet Monica. But for an ambitious, curious, and intellectually gifted teenager like Augustine, the walls of the 4th century church the fundamentalist walls of the 4th century church was never going to hold him. He was way too bright. During Augustine's life, Christianity was a major force in the empire, but had yet to become the default cultural position. In some sense, if you go back, it's different than today, but the kind of pluralism, right, where we feel the plausibility of not believing and these different ways of believing. Augustine felt that. in his own time. Augustine writes of these pressures in his spiritual autobiography when he tells of leaving Christianity to try to find coherence and truth in other options. As a young man, Augustine chased achievement and status. He worked hard to be someone important and got himself into the centers of power and influence. But he couldn't escape a nagging sense of guilt and a deeper hunger that pointed him beyond just Roman glory. He explored a dogmatic rationalism with a religious sect called the Manichaeists. These Manichaeans claimed reason apart from faith. They said they straightforwardly could prove truth, so they thought, and they ridiculed Christianity for relying on faith. The Manichaeans would have had a great YouTube channel with lots of subscribers if they were around today. And Augustine was this young, smart guy rebelling from his mom, rebelling from the North African fundamentalism, and he embraced for a while this kind of macho rationalism. And it worked, kind of, for a while. But he came to see that the Manichaeans mocked religious believers while touting unproven assumptions that they had taken by faith. Such a duplicitous approach led to self-contradicting dead ends. In other words, they were saying, just wait till Faustus, our expert, comes in. He'll explain all these things. And then Faustus, this expert, the leader, shows up and he's like, this guy doesn't have these answers. For a brief time, Augustine tried to be a kind of skeptic. But he came to realize that he needed something more. The ancient skeptics were right to critique the overreach and arrogance of the many overconfident assertions of the people that Augustine had kind of grown up with, whether it was the religious fundamentalists on one side or was the Manichaeans on the other. And so the skeptics kind of offered him this, for a little while, this way he could just kind of be skeptical of everything. But then he realized, how do you live life like that, right? And he knew he had to live somewhere. And then something happened to Augustine during his journey away from the stifling walls of his childhood version of the faith. Augustine developed this kind of posture that I've been describing. He learned to see his own pride as a foundational problem that was holding him back to actually see. He became aware of his vulnerability, his own dependence on others. He came to see that he couldn't 2 + 2 his way to God or to faith. That's not how you answer the big questions of life. Augustine would actually suffer his way to a humility that would produce a deeper way to know, a more true way to live. He came to be aware of how he had perceived God wrongly and had developed the wrong expectations about Christianity. To see clearly, he had to start over. He had to change his posture. See, when I say you have to live somewhere, I'm saying we all have to wager on a way of life. You can't escape that. As Augustine would say, we all believe to understand. And I think this maps pretty well to return finally here to C.S. Lewis when he famously said, I believe in Christianity as I believe in the sun, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Part of this renewed posture is to straighten up, to lean forward, to not only look at Christianity. And by that, part of what I mean by looking at Christianity is to see what it's actually claiming. But this renewed posture also allows us to attend to how stepping into the light of Christ and looking through him begins to actually make sense of life. It gives us a way to live in the midst of what we intuitively know is a world that is broken. So I want to stop here. It might sound like a little odd way to kind of end. And I want to turn to Q&A, but if it's okay, and I didn't ask if I could do this, I want to do something a little different because I want to start with a question for you. And it gives me a second to catch my breath. Some practical reasons here, but I know I'm gesturing with that final point to both looking at Christianity and then looking through Jesus to see if not only does he the claims of Christianity make sense of the world, but also how Jesus gives us a way to live, which actually, I would argue, brings flourishing in the midst of suffering. And I'm gesturing there without fully articulating all those things, because I imagine at a church like this, that's something that you can do and talk about together, and that takes kind of years to work out for, in different ways. But I thought, also because I don't have the time to do that tonight, I do that in Surprised by Doubt, so that's a quick way to kind of go at some of the ways I'm gesturing here. But I thought I would start with a question for the Christians in the room, for those of you who are believers, and I just wonder, how has looking through Christ, or how has stepping into the light of Christ and trying to live out the truth of this good news that we have in Jesus actually changed the way you've lived? How has it brought hope in the midst of sorrow? How has it given you a sense of meaning in the midst of pain? You can go lots of different ways. I'm trying to spark a conversation here. And I know it's a little risky, but it's a small group, so be bold. Anybody want to respond? I think. Go ahead. I think she was. Yeah.
Well, I think another thing of looking through Christ and looking to something outside of yourself. I think if we believe sometimes we want to have the answers and we want to know these things, if we actually are honest with ourselves, if we don't want to carry the weight of that, and I think placing it on Christ and it being outside of ourselves really is if we're truly honest with ourselves, it. I don't know. It takes it off of us. We don't actually want to carry the weight of having all the answers in the whole world, So.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think even one of the things we're seeing with, the more information is better, and then we're surrounded by 24-hour news cycle, and we're living with such angst, and maybe we weren't as humans built for that, and so, and we see the kind of effects when somebody's watching 24-hour news that much. And so even this kind of our capacity to deal with that, we're not very good. Even a couple hours of news. Yeah, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say. I mean, the reality of who Christ is and who God is, being so much bigger than just the physical realms, gives so much more hope to these situations that, man, I can't imagine it. Like my mom passed when I was little. Well, that's a miserable reality until you think bigger than that. Well, does that mean I never get to see her again? No. I know that she was a follower of Christ, and now I am too. And there's not just to see her again, but to be worshiping Christ together. And having this bigger picture of here's, the suffering here doesn't compare to the glory in the future.
Yeah.
So I think that's when I think about the lens of Christ and seeing brokenness, it helps me.
Yeah. Thank you. There's a secular humanist philosopher by the name of Luke Ferry. And Ferry gives a brief history of kind of philosophy. And one of the things he says about Christianity, not a Christian, but he says the reason that Christianity took off is the belief in the resurrection. Not just afterlife, but this belief that there was going to be a physical resurrection. And so there was life after death, but it was fully you, in the sense of even more fully you than even now. And that belief, he says, was so radical. And that he says, even personally, he says, it's tempting. He says, it's tempting. He doesn't believe that. I think there's some good historical reasons. I want to make a case for that. But he says that story is tempting to believe because of the kind of hope that. And he says historically that provided a hope so that Christians were doing things like, going and actually staying in the midst of a plague to care. While the pagans were leaving, the Christians were even caring for their pagans because they actually believed in the resurrection. So it gave them this way to serve because they saw the world very differently than just the here and now. And so that you're talking about this Christian hope. Not that bad things won't happen now, but that's not the final word. That even somebody who doesn't, like Luke Ferry, can say, well, that's tempting to believe that. I'll take that. I'm happy just to open it up. I wanted to start off on that, but I'm happy to open it up or however you guys want to do it.
I have a question.
Okay.
Why do you personally believe? And why are you personally a Christian?
Yeah.
In the face of kind of all that, just doubts, questions.
Yeah. Well, I think one of the things I go back to kind of foundational rock is I believe the resurrection. So to go back to this conversation about resurrection, I think there's good reasons for that. If I could do a whole talk on that, but there's good historical reasons for this. One of the things is you have this belief about resurrection, which I described as a physical resurrection. It's not a popular belief in the ancient world. And so it's not a belief in the time of Christ that people were saying, yes, we're waiting for one person to raise in the middle of human history. Now, there's kind of two, N.T. Wright's work, the historian has laid this out, but he's kind of says there's these two big popular views. One is that, on one hand, you have kind of a resurrected body was in a kind of a Platonic way of thinking about the world is ugly. Like the flesh was nasty, right? Remember, this is a world of, you don't have antibiotics, we can use some historical sensibility to this, but it was actually the physical stuff that we needed to escape. So to imagine a kind of afterlife with a resurrected body, it wasn't even something that was plausible or that they wanted. And so you have that kind of stream of thought in first century Palestine. You also had the other stream of thought, which was, of course, the Jewish stream of thought. But some of the Jews did believe in resurrection, but not all of the Jews did. You had the Sadducees who did not. And so you had this, if they believed in resurrected bodies, in a physical resurrection, they believed that would happen at the end of history, right? So the lion would lay down with the lamb. Like everything would be made right, and then corporately people would be raised as a community. What no one was expecting is one person in the middle of human history to rise from the dead. So you see this in the Gospels, right? If you read the Gospels, you see there like Jesus saying, I'm going to die. I've been reading this with my kids 3 times in Mark. He says, I'm going to die. This is what's going to happen, and I'm going to rise again. And the disciples are like, okay, who's going to be on your right? Seriously, because they don't get it. And the reason they don't get it is even as conservative Jewish men, it wasn't within their plausibility that one man would die and then rise. And so I explain that to say, one of the things you have to do historically is explain, well, how did this thing catch on? It's one thing to make the claim that, okay, there's some kind of ghost, Jesus' spirit, but the claim was very clear. Resurrection means physical body. And so that was one thing going on. That's one of kind of the evidences for the resurrection. I think the other is that you have a body that's not produced, and Ehrman, who's done a lot of work on this, would say, well, they didn't have a body because everybody knows with criminals in wartime, they just leave the body on the cross. So that's why they didn't produce a body, because the body was probably eaten by animals, right? So that's kind of the counter. The problem with this is if that is the claim, then you would think that would have been the kind of pagan rebuttal, the Roman rebuttal to to the Christian claim that there is no body, the tomb is empty. However, that's not the claim they gave. We know that the claim that they gave, because it's in Matthew's gospel, and even if you don't think it's historical, you would say, well, Matthew is kind of rebutting something that's in the air, is that, well, the body was stolen. And so that's kind of the thing that was circulating, and we find that in Matthew's Gospels. So in Matthew's Gospel. So the issue is you don't have a body that's produced. You have this remarkable claim that no one was expecting, and then you also have, in all the traditions that we've been passed down, you have women there. And the problem with women, no offense to the ladies here tonight at all, but in that culture, women were not allowed to testify. They weren't seen as credible witnesses. So if you're making up an account, you don't put women there. That's not a good way to actually promote this view if this is something you're making up. And then you also have this remarkable turn in the disciples. You have this remarkable turn that happens. And so now, are there other ways to explain that historical evidence? Yes. Always with history, we're asking, what is the best explanation? And if you don't, simply subtract out miracles, which is a kind of assumption of the modern world. So if you don't do that, that's becoming less popular today to make that move. But if you're open that there could be a God, then you should be open to the idea that there could be this miracle. And so I really do think that was a very abbreviated kind of case, but I do think some of this comes back to when we look at Jesus, when we look at Christianity, it's coming back to this claim of resurrection and actually digging deep. Now, the other thing I would also want to say is I believe, because when I look at the pages of the gospel, when I read the pages of the gospel, the Gospels provide a portrait of what I find to be the most beautiful and compelling picture of humanity I've ever looked at. This picture of Jesus that grips me, and not only is this beautiful picture of Jesus, but also when I open up the pages of the Gospels, the gospel seems to be reading me in my life. And then when I put this way of life on, and I view the world, I put it on like glasses, it makes sense of everything from my kid's soccer practice when I go. And I go to my son's soccer practice, and on one hand, I can see the beauty of this game. I can see the beauty of kids and parents and interacting and athleticism. And I recognize that the gospel story is the story at the beginning of a good God who created the world and gave us these gifts. But then if I just stay for a little bit longer, things happen at that soccer game. Like the 14-year-old female referee who's being yelled at by a 40-year-old man, not me. Okay, just saying, but and she's crying, and I've got kids, I got parents who are over-invested. Goodness gracious, including the speaker tonight. What's going on here? You've got parents yelling at their 10-year-olds, complaining about the coaches, and I have kids who came to play a game, and they're kind of gravitating towards the end of the bench because they're feeling shame about their own ability. Something's not right. And the biblical story, the gospel hinges kind of on saying, yes, something isn't right. And Christianity explains that. Something's going wrong. We overinvest in good things, and we make them God. And then the gospel, the good news, which is that actually God has come into the world to save it, and that there's redemption. And I've seen these little stories of redemption throughout my life, and the power of God's grace, that He calls rebels. He calls people who are running the other way. He is sons and daughters, and he calls us to worship him. And when we worship him, something happens internally, and our lives begin to be reordered. And so those are profoundly existential reasons at the end there, right? But for me, when somebody says, why do you believe? As humans, we're holistic beings, right? And so to say, well, can you give me rational reasons or existential reasons? And I would say to be rational about our rationality means we have to be honest. All those things are working together when we make a commitment and we say yes. And if you don't believe me, well, let me give you a quick story on this. I was teaching at a university, and I said, who are all the rational, just hard facts? Just make your decision by the facts. And, of course, half the guys raise their hands. And I say, okay, is anybody engaged or married? And one guy raised his hand, and I said, okay, tell me why you married the woman, or why you're engaged to the woman you're engaged to. And I was at a Christian campus, so he said, Proverbs 31 woman. And okay, so if you're not in a Christian home, someone will explain that to you later, okay? It's kind of insider baseball there. But I said, okay, so is she the only Proverbs 31 woman on campus? And he said, no. Okay, so I was like, well, what else you got? And then he felt like I was backing him into a corner, and he said something, and I kind of said, well, there's other women like that on campus. I've seen women like that on campus. So what? Come on. And he said, I just love her, right? And my point in saying that is that we're the most important decisions in your life about what you value, what you sacrifice for, isn't somehow because you've just kind of carted out all of these like facts and evidence, but something deeper is going on. And I think there's something about us as humans that I don't want to deny that. I think that's something about how we were created. And I would argue that if you're worshiping anything else other than the God who created you, there's this fabric to the universe, and there's going to be this kind of push. It might be like all your life you're rich and things are going well, but there's going to be something in here that it's ultimately not going to end well, because we were made to worship God. And so Christianity says, yes, worship him. And as I have, it's not only made sense of life, but it brings a kind of flourishing. Not less pain, not no hardship, but a flourishing in the midst of hardship, in the midst of hard times. So I'm sorry, that was a little long, but in my defense, that was a pretty general question. We're 10 minutes. I am happy to stay a little longer, because I know in a talk like this or different things going on, and there might be some conversations you want to have with me, and I'm happy to stay as I can. I don't know. She's probably like, no, at 9 we got to go. But even if it's right out here, I'm happy to stay and talk. I know I didn't cover, as I said at the beginning, I don't have a wand for any of you, but I do want to offer a good word and give you some hope and point you to some resources if I can. So I'm happy to do that. And if it's okay, is it okay if I close up now and pray?
Sure.
Okay. All right, let's pray. Father, you promise us in your word that you work even through the mystery of suffering. And so, Lord, I know that includes doubt. I know that includes the agony of disillusionment. And so, Lord, I pray that you would do a good work in our lives, that you would refine us, Lord. And I pray for those who are in the midst of figuring out, what does a wager look like for Christianity? What does it mean to wager on Christ? Lord, I pray you'd be with us tonight. I pray your Spirit would be working. and that we would humbly submit. In Jesus' name, amen.